In the fall of 1947, a worker at the Henrio, a discovery at the county courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, would lead to the end of one of the most scary family secrets in the South after the Civil War. Behind a fake. He found a leather bag with papers in it behind a wall in the basement archives. That told the story of Samuel Washington Pierce, a man whose quest for the truth about his father took him to the dark sides of human nature. Robert Jenkins was the courthouse worker. Later said that the moment made them feel uneasy. Someone had put the satchel there on purpose, put away, wrapped in oilcloth, and put behind what looked like a solid brick wall, the only thing that had shown the loose mortar that hid this temporary vault. Jenkins found dozens of handwritten pages, some in beautiful script and others in hurried, desperate scroll. At the top of the words, "The true account of my," were written in fading ink on the first page. Father's chains. As told by his son Samuel Washington Pierce, Anno Domini, 1891. The story started in a small town in 1866, a settlement called Millbrook, which is about 15 miles south of Richmond in the rolling hills of central Virginia. Samuel Pierce first started to doubt everything he thought he knew about his father, Moses Pierce, here, and the reasons he was free. Samuel was born in 1838 and was the son of Moses Pierce and a woman named Ruth, whose last name was never written down in any official paper. Samuel's birth was remarkable not only because of the timing, 8 years before his father was supposed to be free, but the fact that Moses. The 1840 census said that Pierce was a free man of color who owned a small plot of land close to the Appomattox River. Samuel had been okay with his for 28 years, the way their father told them about their family history. According to family law, Moses Pierce was born free and north. He was born in North Carolina, moved to Virginia in his 20s, and worked as a carpenter and little farmer. The story was simple, believable, and not true at all. The first crack in this story came on a hot July morning in 1866, when Samuel was helping his father, who was getting older, clean out an old storage shed on their property. Moses, who was now in his 70s, had becoming weaker and weaker, and his son had to take on more and more of the work, taking care of their small homestead, as they moved big wooden boxes that had been sitting there for decades without being touched, and one of them broke open, showing what was inside. There were chains inside, not the old farm tools or boat anchors that Samuel might have expected, but they were clearly the iron shackles used to hold people back. People. The metal was old and dark, but it was well preserved and had been carved into one of the. On the bigger pieces, there was a name, Mears, and below it, the number 47. When Samuel told his father about what he had found, Moses Pierce did not seem surprised or confused, but of giving up. The old man sat down hard on a wooden stump and looked at the ground for a long time before saying anything. He said softly, "I hoped you would never have to know. I hoped I could take it with me." What came next was not a confession, but a carefully worded explanation that made people ask more questions than it answered. Moses Pierce said that he had been enslaved, but he said that he kept the chains as a reminder of what he had been through. He said that he had bought his own freedom by working extra hours for years and had been legally freed in 1846. He said that the papers had been lost in a fire years before. Samuel wanted to trust what his father said, but something about the explanation didn't sit right with him. The links. The restraints they found were not the simple ones that plantation workers usually wore. They were big, heavy, and fancy, showed signs of long use. Also, the number 47 made me think of a cataloging system that was much more organized and extensive than a simple plantation job. Samuel began to look at his father in a new way over the next few weeks. Eyes. Moses Pierce had always been a quiet man who would go for long periods of time without saying anything. Thoughtful silence, but now those silences felt heavy with things that weren't said. The past. When the old man talked about the past, he would sometimes stop in the middle of a sentence, as if he were catching himself before, giving away too much. During this time of increasing worry, Samuel started to see other strange things about how his father acted. Moses Pierce never slept well, and he often, getting up in the middle of the night to walk around the outside of their property, he had several hiding places in their small house and would sometimes count and recount a small group of gold coins that he kept in cloth. The most disturbing thing was that he would talk to people who weren't there from time to time, having quiet conversations with invisible friends in a voice that was so. Samuel couldn't hear the words because they were so quiet. Millbrook's neighbors had always. People looked up to Moses Pierce and were tired of him at the same time. He was known as A. He was a skilled craftsman who could fix almost anything, but he didn't do it very often. Never went to community events and only socialized. Some of the residents who have been there for a while would sometimes say strange things about the Pierce family that had to do with things that happened before the war, or bringing up Moses Pierce's special deals with some of the area's most important families. Samuel's interest might have stayed that way, just wondering about a father they didn't know, if not by chance. In the last few days of August 1866, Samuel went to Richmond to sell some of his father's carpentry work. Stopped at a bar close to the James River. He heard a conversation there between two old white men that would change how he saw everything. The men were talking about real estate, fights that had started since the war ended, and one of them brought up a case that had to do with the estate of a man named Cornelius Whitmore. Too bad about old Whitmore. One of the guys said that the man owned some valuable things that went missing when he died, such as a test he was doing with his Colorards. The other man nodded as if he understood. I heard he had a special deal of some kind. They also kept detailed records. I wonder what happened to all those papers. Samuel might have thought this was just normal post-war gossip, but there was one thing that stood out. He had seen the name. He had seen Cornelius Whitmore before, carved into a wooden post in his father's shop. He found not only the name, but also a date, 1847, and something else below it when he got home and looked at the post more closely. That there was a string of letters and numbers that looked like a code. Samuel confronted his father again that night, this time with the name in hand. Cornelius Whitmore. Moses Pierce's response was quick and strong. His face lost all its color. His face turned pale and his hands started to shake. Where did you hear that name? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When Samuel told him about the conversation in Richmond and the marking, Samuel had never seen his father get so worked up before. Moses Pierce paced back and forth in their small living room, muttering to himself and stopping to stare out He paced back and forth in their small living room, muttering to himself and stopping every now and then to look out You need to forget that name, Moses Pierce finally said. You need to forget that you ever heard it, and stop asking questions about things that are buried and should stay buried. But Samuel's questions had only gotten worse. Who was Cornelius Whitmore? What was the experimental operation that the men talked about? Why did his father's mention of his name scare him so much? Completely? And most importantly, what was the truth about those chains The answers started to come in September of 1866, when Samuel made a choice that would follow him for the rest of his life. Even though his father told him not to, he went to the Henrio County Courthouse to look for records about Cornelius Whitmore and any property transfers that might have to do with the Pierce family. What he found in those courthouse records was worse than anything he could have thought of. Cornelius Whitmore had a lot of money and owned a lot of land in Central Virginia, including a big estate near the James River. But Whitmore was also something else, a man who was obsessed with what? He called it the psychology of human bondage and was sure that traditional plantation systems didn't work well because they didn't completely break the spirit. Documents filed show that. In 1843, Whitmore went to court and said that local officials had given him permission to do what he said he would do, as research into the best ways to make sure complete subjugation of the black population. A panel of 3 judges had approved the request, and all 3 had noted that Whitmore's research could be useful for keeping order as the abolitionist movement grew. The official records used clinical language, but they showed how systematic. Experimentation that went way beyond what Samuel thought was possible. Whitmore had been given permission to buy people for his research, and he had been given permission to keep them in specially built buildings on his land. The records say that the subjects would be kept apart from other enslaved people and forced to go through different methods meant to gauge and improve psychological compliance. Samuel discovered his father's name in a ledger from 1847. Subject 47 was Moses Pierce, a man who was about 35 years old. Years obtained from the estate of the deceased J. Harrison recorded opposition to. The authority chosen for long-term study had a note next to his father's name. That made Samuel's blood run cold. A great reason to be alone. The techniques work well with separation anxiety protocols. But the last entry in Moses Pierce's file showed the most disturbing truth. In 1854, there was a short note 7 years after his father supposedly bought his own freedom. Subject 47 was let go to independent custody under an ongoing observation agreement. The subject keeps. Assigned identification and monitoring will go on forever. Samuel now understood why his father had kept those chains and why the mention of. Moses was so scared of Cornelius Whitmore's name that he couldn't even think straight. Pierce had never bought his freedom. He had been set free as part of an ongoing experiment, and for more than 12. He had been living in conditions that Samuel was just starting to understand for years. That night, Samuel came back home with copies of all the papers he could find. His father was sitting on there. He was sitting on the front porch, looking out at the road as if he had been waiting, when he saw Samuel coming with papers in his. Moses Pierce just nodded. "So, now you know," he said quietly. "At least you know some of it." The next conversation was the hardest of. Samuel's father was free from the burden of keeping secrets because of his son. Discovery started to tell the real story of his time with Cornelius Whitmore, and the tests that had been done at the faraway estate near the James River. Moses said that Whitmore. Pierce was sure that the old ways of keeping enslaved people alive were rough and not effective. He thought that by carefully controlling people's minds, he could make subjects who would police themselves, and they would be so broken that they would never even think about escaping. Or resistance. Whitmore's methods were meant to attack every part of a person's sense of self. The subjects were kept alone for weeks at a time, then suddenly put in groups where they had to compete for basic needs. They were told lies about their families and told that loved ones had died or forgot about them. Their schedules were always changing, rules that aren't always the same and constant watching. But the most harmful Whitmore's system included something he called voluntary compliance documentation. Participants were obligated to compose comprehensive reports regarding their psychological condition, chronicling their fears and anxieties, hopes, and how they planned to deal with their situation. These reports were then used to create even more specific types of psychological pressure. Moses Pierce had been subject 47 for 7 years, and during that time he had to take part in his own psychological breakdown. He had written hundreds of pages about his own mental worsening, and those pages had been used to come up with methods that were used on other subjects. The most terrifying thing that came to light was that Whitmore's experiments had not ended with the subject's release, the agreement to keep observing the subject that had. Moses Pierce's freedom in 1854 was part of a long-term study that was meant to find out how long the psychological techniques that had been used had an effect. For more than 12 years, Moses Pierce had been watched all the time, and everything he did was being recorded and looked at. The gold coins that Moses Pierce counted so many times were payments he got for sending in monthly reports about his mental health and how he interacted with others, with his family and neighbors, as well as any thoughts or feelings that might show he still has trouble with authority. People who couldn't sleep would walk around their property at night as part of a security plan. Protocol he had been taught to follow. The worst thing that happened was that Samuel learned that Moses's own birth and upbringing were part of the experiment. Pierce had been told to have children and raise them in a certain way that would lead to the next group of people who will do what they're told. Samuel's childhood, including his education, friendships, and other parts of his life. Whitmore had carefully planned Samuel's relationship with his father as part of his research, as Samuel took in. He started to understand other parts of his life after hearing these things. That had never really made sense. His father pushed him to stay away from the rest of the community and put a lot of stress on. His distrust of authority figures and his unwillingness to talk about family history. All of these had been parts of an ongoing psychological experiment. Moses Pierce, on the other hand, had not just sat back and let his son. As the years went by, he had started to subtly undermine the requirements for his reporting, giving his handlers false information, and slowly teaching Samuel how to think independently, even though their situation made it hard. The talks with Samuel thought the invisible friends he saw were real, but they were just rehearsals. Moses Pierce had been writing different drafts of his monthly reports in an effort to come up with answers that would please his observers while keeping his son from getting too involved in the experiment. The hiding places all over. Their house had more than just valuable things. It also had copies of every report Moses Pierce had sent in over the years, along with notes that told the real story about their family life. He had been getting ready for the day when Samuel would find out the truth, and he wanted to make sure that his son would be able to read the whole story over the next few weeks as Samuel. As he thought about everything he had learned, he started to make plans. He knew that his father was stuck in a situation where there was no easy way out, but he also knew that the system relied on secrecy and the compliance of its victims. If the truth about Whitmore's experiments could be made public, it might be possible to break the secrecy and free not just his father, but maybe dozens of other people who were still living in similar situations. Samuel started by looking into Whitmore's estate and the state of the research operation. What he found was that Cornelius Whitmore died in 1863, but someone else kept doing his work. A group of friends who had started the Institute for Social Research, Lee, the institute worked out of. of a building in Richmond and said they were studying how to rebuild after the war, but Samuel knew it was a continuation of the psychological tests that had shaped his father's life. The current head of the institute is Dr. Frederick Ashford, who was one of Whitmore's first research partners. Public records show that Dr. Ashford was a well-respected member of Richmond Society, where he served on several charitable boards and often writing articles about the psychology of social order for well-known journals. Samuel's plan was simple but risky. He would collect proof of the Institute's ongoing operations, record the experiences of as many subjects as possible, and deliver a full report to authorities who had not been compromised by their connections with Whitmore's original research. The risk was huge. If he got caught, he would probably disappear completely before he could present his evidence, joining the ranks of people whose questioning had gone too far. The first challenge was finding other subjects. Samuel knew that his father wasn't the only one being watched all the time, but the subjects had been taught to keep their distance from each other and keep up the charade of their normal lives. Samuel would have to find ways to. He started by studying how to get in touch without setting off the surveillance systems that kept an eye on their activities. The payment records he found in his father's papers. Moses Pierce got monthly payments of came from an account at the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Richmond. The payments followed a pattern that suggested that there were more than one recipient. Samuel was able to figure out who else was at the bank by watching it for a few weeks. People who seemed to be getting the same payments on a regular basis. One of these people was a woman named Charlotte Thompson, who lived by herself in a small house on the edge of Richmond. She was like Moses Pierce in that, kept up with strict schedules, stayed away from other people, and showed the subtle signs that someone is under a lot of mental stress all the time. Samuel started following her quietly, looking for chances to talk to her without being seen. The chance came in. In October 1866, Charlotte Thompson made what looked like an unplanned visit to. Samuel followed her to a cemetery outside of Richmond and watched as she knelt by a grave, marked only with initials and a date, RT1 1849 to 1852. After Charlotte Thompson left the cemetery, Samuel went to the grave and saw that someone had left a small, wrapped in cloth. Inside the bundle was a letter written in a careful. Someone who should not be reading this should know that the truth is bigger than you think, and that there are more of us than you think. The letter was signed Subject 31 and had a lot of information about the. Samuel realized that Charlotte Thompson was not just another victim of Whitmore's experiments. She was part of an underground network of subjects who had been secretly working to document and experiments. She was part of a secret group of people who were working to record and document, resist the research that is going on. The network had more than 20 people who lived in Virginia and North Carolina and were all people who had been in Whitmore's original experiments and were now being watched in different ways all the time. They had been talking to each other using a complicated system of coded messages left in public places. For years, collecting proof and waiting for the right time to show the full. Samuel's discovery of the network marked the start of the most dangerous phase of his investigation. The subjects had been planning their exposure for years, but they had been waiting for someone who had legal standing, who wasn't officially a subject, and who wasn't directly being watched to give their evidence to the authorities. Samuel knew how serious the request was. Samuel knew how serious it was that they had to show their evidence to the authorities. If he agreed to be their representative, he would be committing to a course of action that would. If he failed, he would almost certainly die, but he also knew that his father and dozens of other people would stay stuck in their mental prisons unless someone was ready to take that chance. In November 1866, Samuel made up his mind. He would serve as the network's spokesperson and show their proof to the right people. But first, he would write down everything they had learned in a detailed report that could be kept for all time. Samuel's account of Whitmore's experiments and their ongoing effects was written over the next few months and became the document that was found in the courthouse basement in 1947. It had detailed descriptions of the psychological methods that had been used, as well as copies of official documents that gave permission for the research, transcripts of testimony from several subjects, and a full organizational chart of the Institute and how it works right now. But Samuel's story also had something that the subjects had not expected, evidence that the experiments had been far more extensive than even they had no idea. Samuel's research had found links between Whitmore's Institute and similar operations in other states, hinting at a network of psychological research centers that had been open in the South since the 1840s. The amount of information Samuel had found was mind-blowing. Thousands of people had been the subject of systematic psychological testing for more than 20 years, and some of them were still being watched and controlled all the time. The network of subjects in Virginia was just one small part of a huge system that had made it through the Civil War and was still going strong, operate under new reasons, and get money from new sources. Samuel's. The written account ended with a detailed plan for exposing the whole network and freeing all of its members. Because the Institute's operators would move quickly, the plan needed careful coordination and exact timing to get rid of evidence and keep witnesses quiet if they found out about the investigation. The plan was never put into action. In March 1867, Samuel disappeared just as he was about to give his proof to the federal government in Washington. His father found his room empty one morning, with no signs of a fight or any other sign of where he might have gone. Moses Pierce waited weeks for news of his son's fate, but they never got a message. The other people in the network found out about Samuel's disappearance through their communication system, and they knew right away what it. People had found out about their plan, and now they were in more danger then. One by one, the subjects started to disappear too. Some of them just disappeared from their homes, and others died in accidents that were carefully planned to look like they happened naturally. After his son went missing, Moses Pierce lived for 3 more years, keeping up the appearance of a normal life, knowing that he was probably being watched even more closely than before. He kept sending in his monthly reports and getting paid, but he also did things to make sure that he wrote down everything that happened so it would live on even if he didn't. Moses Pierce died in his sleep. In 1870, and neighbors who were worried about him found his body when he didn't show up for a few days. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the local doctor who looked at the body found some things about the scene that bothered him. Moses. It looked like Pierce had died while sitting at his kitchen table. There were 2 things on the table, a set of keys to different places in the house, along with a note that said, "Tell the true story." The neighbors who found Moses Pierce's body followed his last instructions and looked in all the hiding places for it. The house. What they found was so disturbing that they decided to talk to church leaders in the area about it. Instead of getting the police involved, who might know the people mentioned in the papers. After looking at the evidence, the church leaders decided to hide the papers instead of putting lives at risk of more people by trying to expose the conspiracy. They locked Samuel's account and the evidence that backed it up. They put the evidence in a leather bag and hid it behind a fake wall in the courthouse basement, where they thought it would stay safe until they could show it to the world. Would stay safe until it was safe to tell. That time never came during there, and the secret of the hidden documents was passed down through a small group of church leaders who kept the conspiracy of silence going for more than 70 years. It wasn't until the maintenance worker found it by chance in 1947 that Samuel Pierce's story came to light. In 1947, a worker finally brought Samuel Pierce's story to light. Robert Jenkins, a maintenance worker, brought the papers to the attention of courthouse officials, who then sent them to the federal government. A quiet investigation began, but it quickly ran into problems that made it seem like some parts of the original conspiracy were still going on. A number of the federal investigators who started looking into the case were moved to other jobs without explanation. Others said they were being followed and that their homes had been searched by people they didn't know. Individuals. In the end, the investigation was classified and sealed by officials, saying it was for national security reasons that were never made clear to the public. The papers were sent back to the courthouse archives, where they stayed until 1968, when they were moved to, as part of a regular reorganization of the archives at a federal facility. The bag with Samuel Pierce's account went missing during the transfer, and it is now missing, are unknown. The few officials who had looked at the papers before they went missing said that Samuel Pierce's account had named more than 1,500 people who had been put through psychological tests for more than 40 years. The experiments persisted into the 20th century, evolving and adapting to new social and political situations, but still with the same main goal of learning how to psychological control. The breadth of the conspiracy indicated a level of coordination and institutional support that went way beyond what Samuel Pierce had been able to write down what he found in his first investigation. Government agencies, schools, and many different types of organizations, including schools, businesses, and private research groups, had been involved in helping and paying for the research, making a web of people who are in on it that made exposure very hard and risky. More than 80 years later, Samuel Pierce started looking into his father's chains, and he found out the whole truth about. The results of Cornelius Whitmore's experiments are still a mystery. Researchers who try to find out more about them. The case report ran into problems that were systematic, like missing records, sealed archives, and institutional resistance that points to active efforts to keep things secret. The few records that are still around and can be found in public archives give hints about what was hidden, but they leave us with more questions than answers. Government papers from the 1940s and 1950s make vague references to inconsistencies in historical research and legacy subject management protocols that seem to be related to Whitmore's original research, but the specifics are still secret or missing. Academic. Researchers who have endeavored to examine the psychological methodologies formulated by Whitmore and his colleagues indicate finding pieces of research papers and letters that say the experiments lead to big steps forward in comprehending human psychological susceptibility. These advancements seem to have been included in a number of military and government programs over the years, but the links are carefully hidden, and the original research is still not available. The evidence shows that Samuel Pierce's investigation found something much more important and dangerous than just a case of abuse in the past. The psychological experiments that started with Cornelius Whitmore in the 1840s seem to have turned into a long-term research project that may have gone on well into the modern era. The methods that were created through systematic torture and psychological manipulation of enslaved individuals were evidently deemed too valuable to relinquish upon the abolition of slavery itself was ended. Instead, they were improved, made bigger, and used in new populations based on new reasons, which led to a steady stream of research. That goes back more than 100 years. The people who took part in this research were not just the original victims, such as Moses Pierce, as well as their kids, grandkids, and subsequent generations born into systems intended to mold and control their psychological growth from the moment they are born. The experiment Samuel. Pierce's findings did not merely examine individual psychological compliance, but were coming up with ways to make whole populations that would police themselves and accept their subjugation as normal and unavoidable. Samuel Pierce's own disappearance. Themselves and accept their subjugation as natural and inevitable. The disappearance of Samuel Pierce himself reminds us of how far the people who run these programs will go to keep their secrets safe. The investigation had gotten too close to not only revealing the historical record of past abuses, but also the ongoing operations that were still going on and growing. The few people who have tried to keep Samuel Pierce's work going have run into the same problems and dangers. Researchers have run into the same problems and dangers that other people have vanished. Archives have been mysteriously destroyed, and witnesses have died in strange ways that make people not want to look into it any further. Investigation. But Samuel Pierce's legacy is not completely gone. The network of subjects he found had been writing about their experiences for years and collecting proof. And even though a lot of them were killed after he went missing, some of their records, these pieces lived on in hiding places that were never found, keep coming up from time to time, giving us a look at the whole picture of what was hidden. Samuel's bravery. Pierce's bravery in seeking the truth about his father's chains, even though it put him in great danger, is an inspiration for those who are still looking for answers about one of the darkest times in American history. The investigation showed not only how horrible what happened to people like Moses Pierce was, but also how it was done on purpose. The kinds of programs that are made to study and improve psychological control. The questions Samuel Pierce asked about fairness and accountability are still. The men who came up with and carried out these experiments are still relevant today, held accountable for what they did. In many cases, they were praised as famous researchers and community leaders. Their crimes were hidden behind classifications and institutions. Protections that are still in place today. The people who were hurt by these tests, like Moses Pierce and others, had to live their whole lives in these conditions. Psychological imprisonment, unable to escape even after their physical chains were taken away. Their suffering was made worse by the fact that their experiences were being studied and used to improve skills that would be used on other people. The kids and the grandchildren of these victims, including Samuel Pierce himself, were raised in an environment shaped by trauma they could not understand and psychological manipulation they could not identify. A lot of them lived their whole lives without really understanding what was going on around them and accepting the restrictions and anxieties that had been meticulously nurtured as elements of their familial heritage. The consequences of these experiments reach well beyond their direct victims. The methods created by this research seem to have been used in a number of institutional settings and government programs over the years that have changed how we think about education, the criminal justice system, the military, training and social control that still affect millions of people today. Knowing the history of, to understand how these techniques work and how they were developed, it is important to know their roots. Application and resisting their effects. Samuel Pierce's research offers a roadmap for finding institutional crimes that are meant to stay hidden, and his method for building. Networks of resistance among the victims themselves provide a framework for organization. against systematic oppression. The tale of Samuel Pierce and the chains of his father is ultimately a story about the strength of truth and the bravery needed to follow it. It is also a reminder that some truths are hard to accept when there is a lot of opposition, are thought to be too dangerous to share, and those who try to do so must be ready to pay the highest price for their dedication to justice. The chains Moses Pierce wore as a reminder of his pain were not just a sign of his physical bondage, proof of a planned program to make people psychologically dependent. That would last longer than any legal freedom. Finding those chains led Samuel Pierce to find a conspiracy that went much further than he could have imagined. His investigation showed him the real extent of programs that still affect American society today. The silence that. The secrecy that surrounds this case is not by chance or by accident. It is actively kept up by organizations that have a strong interest in keeping these things hidden. Hidden. The loss of documents, the sorting of records, and these are not bureaucratic mistakes. They are planned policies that make it harder to study these topics, made to keep operations going and avoid punishment for crimes that happened in the past. Those who try to, people who break this silence, face risks that go far beyond their jobs or schoolwork. The consequences for Samuel Pierce and the other people who try to expose these. Experiments show that some knowledge is too dangerous to have and that institutions will go to great lengths to keep their secrets safe. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most systematic efforts to suppress it. The pieces of evidence that keep coming up, the testimonies that remain in hidden records, and the effects that continue to happen. Of these programs that we can see in today's world, all point to Samuel Pierce's investigation into his father's chains opened a door to a reality that can't be completely hidden, that those in power have been trying to close for more than a century. The legacy of courage in seeking the truth, even when it came at a personal cost, still inspires people who want to bring to light institutional crimes and hold people accountable for the past. Unfairness. The chains that Moses Pierce saved weren't just proof of what showed what had happened to him and how determined he was to make sure the truth would eventually come to light. His son's investigation and the network of resistance that Samuel found, those chains became the key to one of the darkest secrets in American history, more than 75 years after Samuel Pierce's. His investigation is still not finished, and the full scope of the experiments, the people who did it have never been punished, and the victims have never been revealed. But his work goes on through those who won't let these things go unpunished. Crimes stay hidden, and who keep looking for the truth about one of the most. Long-term and organized programs of psychological testing on humans. The troubling legacy of Cornelius Whitmore and his colleagues in history reminds us that institutions can be evil in ways that are not limited to far-off times in history or governments in other countries, the methods they came up with, and the programs they set up ran for decades in American institutions, where they were kept secret and made possible by the help of well-known people in society. Understanding this, history is necessary to comprehend how analogous programs may function in contemporary times and to develop the vigilance needed to stop them from happening again. The psychological methods that were developed through the systematic torture and manipulation of enslaved individuals have evolved and adapted over time, yet there. The primary objective is to foster psychological compliance and inhibit resistance to authority. Unchanged. Samuel Pierce's investigation serves as a paradigm for identifying and combating these programs, but it also shows how much it can cost a person to resist. Those who choose to pursue this truth, one must be ready for the consequences and aware that they are challenging. forces that have shown they are willing to get rid of any threats to their privacy. The chains that got Samuel Pierce to start his investigation were real things that could be held and looked at, but they were like psychological chains that were much harder to see and break. The real horror of what Moses Pierce went through wasn't just the physical restraint, but the planned destruction of his sense of self and the ability to picture freedom. Cornelius Whitmore's tests, conducted, were meant to create a kind of psychological slavery that would be more complete and longer lasting than physical bondage. He came up with these methods to make. Resistance was not only challenging or perilous, but truly inconceivable for. Samuel Pierce's investigation showed that these methods had been used on his subjects, very successful, not only in controlling individual subjects but also in making systems of psychological control that could be kept up over time. The children and grandchildren of the original subjects were born into environments that had been carefully planned to affect their mental growth and make it harder for them to think for themselves. For more than 20 years, Moses Pierce was under constant surveillance and control. This was not just punishment for his past resistance, but an active research program aimed at examining the long-term effects of psychological conditioning and to create new ways to stay in charge of populations. The reports that Moses Pierce had to send in were not just tools for keeping an eye on things, but also tools for collecting data that gave researchers a lot of information about how their subjects were feeling and how well, different ways to control things. This information was then used to make things better and enhance the techniques employed to sustain psychological dominance over others. Samuel Pierce found a network of subjects that was itself part of. Of the experiment, researchers looked at how people who had been hurt psychologically, conditioning would interact, and if they could organize effective resistance. Watching this network gave us useful information about the limits of the control methods and the conditions under which subjects may commence the restoration of their capacity for autonomy. Action. Samuel Pierce's investigation was permitted to advance to its current extent because it gave researchers new information about how subjects would react to finding out the truth about their situation. His records. The researchers got a full picture of how their methods worked when they learned about the network and his plans for resistance could be dealt with and what steps needed to be taken to stop future resistance. The disappearance of Samuel Pierce and the planned destruction of the subject network were not just defensive to protect the program's secrecy, but it was also a continuation of the researchers were looking into how well they could get rid of resistance movements and how completely they could stop people from trying to find out what they were doing. The decades. The secrecy that has surrounded this case is not just because of bureaucratic or institutional inertia, obstruction, but show that there is an active policy of keeping things hidden that is still in place. Because the research programs are still going on, the methods, developed by Cornelius Whitmore and improved over many years of testing, are still in use. Today, exposing their historical roots would put current operations at risk. Samuel's bravery. Pierce's bravery in continuing this investigation, even though it put him in great danger, is one of the most important examples of fighting against systematic psychological abuse in American history. He was willing to put his own safety at risk for the sake of truth and justice, which left a lasting impact. Still inspire people who have to make similar choices today. The chains that Moses Pierce's possessions were more than just things he owned. They were symbols of a kind of slavery that was meant to be hidden and last forever. Samuel Pierce's investigation changed those chains from signs of being a victim into tools of resistance and revelation the real test of Samuel Pierce's bravery is not just that. He was ready to risk his life to bring these crimes to light, but he was able to get past mental conditioning that had been set up just for the purpose of making it hard to resist. Impossible. He was able to see through the carefully built lies of the family's normal life, and to question the basic ideas that had shaped. His world is a victory of human consciousness over systematic manipulation. Samuel Pierce found a network of subjects that they had done something that their oppressors thought was impossible. They had gotten over the psychological conditioning. That was meant to keep them alone and obedient, but they had planned a strong resistance to their continued exploitation. They could keep their communications secret and work together. For years, they were able to carry out their plans without being caught, which is one of the most successful resistance movements in the history of psychological oppression. The records that these people made, even though they were very dangerous, involved, gives some of the most thorough and trustworthy proof that is out there about the type and extent of systematic psychological experiments that were done by American institutions. Their testimonies show not only what happened, done to each of them, but also how psychological control methods were developed, tested, and improved over decades of systematic research. The fate. These brave people are both an inspiration and a warning for people who might think about doing the same thing today. Their bravery in writing about what happened to them and the pursuit of justice for their suffering established a historical record that endures despite systematic attempts to. But getting rid of them also shows how far those who want to stop it will go. Samuel Pierce's investigation into his secrets shows how far those in power will go to keep them safe. Father's chains eventually showed chains that were much bigger and more durable than anything he could have thought of. The chains that were made of. The chains that held Moses Pierce were only a physical sign of the mental chains that had. Not just people, but whole communities and generations. Finding out this truth cost a lot, but it also made possibilities for comprehension and defiance that were previously absent. Samuel Pierce's bravery in going through with this investigation, even though he knew what might happen, opened a door that can't be completely closed and left behind a legacy that still inspires people who want to understand and fight against systemic oppression. The questions. People still don't know the answers to the questions that Samuel Pierce asked about accountability and justice. But his investigation gave us a plan for how to keep looking for the truth. His example still inspires those who are facing similar options. The chains he found may have been bigger than he thought, but those who made the chains thought that people who were brave enough to face them would never be free. Impossible. The story of Samuel Washington Pierce and how he looked into his father's chains is, in the end, a story about how the truth can survive even the most organized attempts to hide it, and how brave needed to seek that truth, even when there is a lot of opposition. It is a reminder that some truths are too dangerous to share, but also that no matter how hard you try to keep those truths hidden, they always seem to come out. The chains that Moses Pierce kept as a reminder of his pain became the key through his son's bravery and sacrifice. That opened up one of the most important and disturbing secrets in American history. The investigation that started. The discovery of those chains showed that there is a conspiracy that goes on beyond what most people could think of. But it also showed that even the most organized and people who have sophisticated ways of oppressing others can fight back and show how they are doing it. The guts to look for the truth. And maybe that's what Samuel is in the end. Pierce's most important legacy is not just the specific truths he found, but he showed what can happen when someone won't accept The limits that have been put on their understanding and their need to know the real truth about their world, no. No matter what the price is.